Good day to everyone. A very warm welcome to this 33rd session of the 9th South-South Forum on Sustainability. Today, we have our last but one session on the theme of the collapse of modern civilization and the future of humanity. My name is Lau Kin Chi. I'm coordinator of the program on Cultures of Sustainability, Center for Cultural Research and Development of Lingnan University. I am also a founding member of the Global University for Sustainability and director of its executive team. In the past 32 sessions, we have had eminent speakers analyzing various aspects of the civilizational crisis that confront humanity today. We have covered political economy, stagflation, food crisis, climate change, and others. Today, we are most pleased and honored to have with us Professor Huang Ping to scrutinize modernity from the perspective of its challenges to the self and to ecology. We will also have three eminent scholars as discussants, Professor Dai Jinhua, Professor Jung-Ok, and Professor Manoranjan MOHANTY. I will introduce them before they speak. Let me introduce Professor Huang Ping. Professor Huang Ping is currently director of the Center for Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences and executive president of the Chinese Institute of Hong Kong. He is formerly director of the Institute of American Studies and the director of the Institute of European Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences and the former co-executive editor-in-chief of Readings, together with Professor Wang Hui during 1996 to 2007. With their editorship, Readings was a very important journal of contemporary thought and was very influential among progressive scholars and the young generation. I remember when Professor Huang traveled with a group of Chinese scholars, including Professor Dai Jinhua and Professor Wen Tiejun, for a study trip to Mexico in 2002. We were staying in dormitories, and he would be the first to go for a shower, then would lay out a huge pile of Readings manuscripts to edit. Then we would be looking for internet shops to send his edited scripts back to China. I'm sure Professor Dai remembers these episodes. Professor Huang has authored and co-authored many books, including In Search for Survival, a sociological study of rural-urban migration, Unfinished Narratives, Experiences from Western China, Reports and Rethinking of Development and Poverty, Misleading and Development, and Our Times, Where China Today Comes From and Where She Is Going. He is also the editor-in-chief of books including China Reflected, China and Globalization, Washington Consensus or Beijing Consensus, and recently, Transcultural Dictionary of Misunderstandings. He has been on the editorial board of the British Journal of Sociology, Current Sociology, Comparative Sociology, Global Social Policy, and Journal of Migration. So today, we are also very grateful to our interpreters between Spanish and English, that is Julieta Mendez and Salome Bustani. Our English-Chinese interpreters, Huang Xiaomei and Li Menghong. Our Korean and Chinese interpreters, Ji Yunrong, Wen Lu, and Wang Sanguo. And our interpreters between Japanese and Chinese, Liu Jia, Wang Dai, Yang Mengmeng, and Liu Jiajun. And so we thank our interpreters. So now, Professor Huang, you have 45 to 60 minutes, please.
I'm approaching this issue of modernity from two perspectives. That is, its challenge to the South and to ecology. As for the perspective of ecology, on this forum or other platforms, we've discussed a lot about this, but still I would like to talk about this from my own personal perspective. And then I will go on to talk about its challenge to the self. Not just challenge, but maybe it can be a trap or a difficulty. From the ecological perspective, I'd like to bring up this proposition, well, just for your thoughts or even for debate or further discussion. In my opinion, or humanity, at least it seems that it's so far the only species that uses constant destruction in exchange for its survival. We are the only species that does this. We constantly destruct our way of life so as to be able to survive. There is no other species, no any other animal or plant does this. We are continuing creating waste, rubbish, toxics, and things that are harmful to ourselves, to the world, and to the earth. And as this kind of species, we've been around for hundreds of thousands of years, and scripts have been invented thousands of years ago. Yet the capitalist modernity seems to be an irresistible trend with a rapid speed that leads us to self-destruction. It imposes such way of life and production on us. Because of this capitalist modernity, we are doing this self-destruction at a higher speed and higher intensity. This process has been sped up by capitalist modernity. So it can be said that this seems to be a cancer of the society, and it's continuously spreading. So I believe, first of all, we're the only species that use self-destruction in exchange for survival. Second, capitalist modernity seems to be enhancing and speeding up this process in a specific means of way of production and design of system to speed up this process. So to go to greater details, first of all, initially we were just like other animals and plants. We used to be part of nature. However, since the emergence of the capitalist modernity, however, well, maybe even earlier, I'll go to this later. Ever since there is this way of production and the way of life that derived from this way of production. After Karl Marx passed away, Engels talked about this in multiple writings. So we used to be part of nature, yet we are increasingly isolated from nature and increasingly opposing nature. Isolation alone seems to be acceptable, but now there's more conflicts and opposition with nature, and we are damaging it and destroying it. Or maybe unconsciously or consciously, we are destroying ourselves. And something relevant, strictly speaking, that is compared with older way of life, that is collecting and hunting. agriculture civilization already begun its damage of nature. So they settled down and cultivate the land, let alone the modern agriculture that uses chemicals and use monoculture. So strictly speaking, agriculture civilization have already begun serious damage of nature, but compared with that of the modern capitalism, however, it is almost negligible, and it seemed to be the only imaginable and practicable way or alternative to stand against the negative impacts of the capitalist modernity and its destruction of nature. Of course, it does not mean that we should simply go back to the traditions or mechanically go back to the traditions like it was hundreds of years ago back in China. That's something that seemed really poetic. The simple, nostalgic way is increasingly impossible. However, we should seek opportunities or possibilities for a new integration of the urban and rural area, or in other words, in a newer catchword in China, that is rural rejuvenation, revitalization, or we should try to find a new way or explore a new way that had existed back then in China, where historically in southern China there used to be cities or towns of different sizes that is supported by the rural area with its features of trusted family relationship, mutual help, mutual trust, and all lifestyle and production were based on this. In this regard, this cultural evolution that occurred in southern China back then is something that have been discussed by a renowned Chinese scholar, Philip Huang, who is still teaching in Renmin University of China. He borrowed this concept of evolution from an anthropologist. This Professor Huang's discussion of this Chinese Southern evolution is something that has the features of low efficiency of production. My study and research of the southern China began in the 1980s. And through my research, however, I discovered that in that area, this pattern of rural-urban integration, the agricultural production and the lifestyle evolution not only was not necessarily negative, it might even be on the contrary, that it is precisely because we have this evolution that they were able to have the well-developed Chinese southern areas where some of the cities were even compared to a paradise. At the Shanghai Expo, I gave a speech and talk about why some of the Chinese southern cities used to be compared to a paradise from a sociological perspective. And today I'll talk a little about this, why this evolution lead to this paradise, let alone cultural, social, and political way of organization of a rural society. only from the perspective of input and output, and performance. We only use this cost analysis only through these rationales. And we need to define the basic measuring unit like input, output, revenue, what other items, and a time frame it needs to be designed, like how long is the period that we want to probe into. If we want to make this cost analysis and apply this on one single generation, since the Song Dynasty or even earlier, the southern China have become the most prosperous area of China. If we only make this cost analysis from the perspective of the individual, we'll see that it is very heavily populated with per unit land, a small per unit land. And this analysis will lead to the conclusion that it's not worthy. However, it's not just limited to that area. All those numerous cities, towns, and rural villages there, we do not calculate this input, this cost at the measurement unit, using the measurement unit of one individual, but a household. And also, we should consider this in terms of several generations, and then we will come to a completely different conclusion. For example, in a household where there are 3 sons and parents, they only have 2 moles of land. One child engages in cultivation, and per unit production will be 150 kilos. And if there are 3 of them all do this, there will be only about 300 kilos of production of rice. This margin does not increase a lot, but the master of this household, the parents in this household, however, they do not cultivate their production this way. When we were researching there, they listened to them and they talk about it this way.
If the 3 boys all went for farming, then the food for the whole year, for the whole family, will be soft. So once these 3 boys got married with 3 wives, and these wives can also dedicate to the raising the livestock, or even going to sell some vegetables, or do some extra works. So now we don't need so much. Such a big amount of the production. The third son can even go to work in some industries. So that's how this kind of village industry, also called rural industry, this is how it started. It even started before the 1949. And once the reform started, now we have this kind of township owned enterprises. Now, when we back to the household is the basic unit instead of the whole working team of the village, because the wives can go to do some work when they have children, which means the grandchildren of the family. Now they become the family that is it can even become some kind of rich family, because they would have their fish tanks, they have some clothes for selling, even silk. like the famous silk industry from Suzhou. Now the third generation can dedicate it to study, and so now we can see that the whole plan is considered in the unit of family, of the whole family, the household. The second generation can dedicate it to the agriculture, and the third generation can dedicate to learning. From this way of viewing, actually the marginal benefits are growing instead of reducing. They don't just limit their calculation to one generation. If you have to use the word of development, this logic of development even exists in the similarly poor Yunnan, Guizhou, Gansu province, or even the Inner Mongolia, Tibet, of these minority groups zones. This kind of logic also exists there. It's different from capitalism. It's not just calculated from the point of view of individuals. Actually, the poorer the places are, the so-called poor area, according to the logic of economics, this different alternative logic is the one that sustains all the generations to fight against the harsh natural conditions. No matter how fragile the surviving conditions are. Like there once was no water, no road, no this so-called development, but they enjoyed a good life. Recently, I was during the pandemic, and for many years, me and Professor Lau Kin Chi, we had been studying on the topic of society. I think for society, the basic factors for the community, for the society, well, community as the basic unit of the society. And also today, when we want to reconstruct the society, not this kind of hostile society that we are facing now. The most basic factors is identity. This kind of identification that you can identify the people around you as like part of a community, that you have this kind of self-identification. When I am in my community, I will have this kind of innate security. The security was not promoted through the state mechanism, but come from this kind of trust between the social members. That is how the security is built. The third factors, of course, everybody has their own life, has their own family life, or based on the relation the relation of kinship. But when in front of some kind of, like, for example, earthquake or pandemic, we will have this kind of solidarity to mutual assistance. And these three factors, identity, security, solidarity, is how we can rebuild the society, to rebuild the community, which is more important than this kind of so-called individual freedom, individual security. So as more as a community, at least now China is promoting social reconstruction and also a new type of rural-urban integration. Among this, the ecological organic agriculture, including all this agriculture, including all the sidelines, including forestry, husbandry, sidelines, fishery, clothing, etc. This is the rural reconstruction based on the ecological agriculture. And this is is contrast to this kind of alienation, what I mentioned before, the development at the cost of alienation. So now I'm going to go to the second point about the self, or which type are we looking, which type of development we want, this kind of like so-called individual development, or using the new term, the fancy term, sustainable development. So actually this paradox is also, this dilemma is also between the so-called capitalist development, because this capitalist development is talking about the external benefits. The individual, because when they are doing that, when the capitalism only talking about, when it comes to the natural disaster, they are talking about this is all the external cost that is not part of their responsibility. So modernity comes from the West Europe for 3 years. But some people would also date back to the resonance. Well, modernity is the whole system. Modernity is the whole system of like production and also institution. But on the other side is also the discover of the self, or the so-called liberation of individuality. This is the basic characteristic of the modernity. But this is also where the biggest paradox lies, because it is talking about the liberation of the self, because they started when the secular life is divided, is separated from the religion. But this kind of self liberation put people in this endless self confusion. Especially in the more developed area, you will see more a war situation, like in the North Europe, where everything seems very nice. The sky is blue and the birds are singing. Well, the situation is worse, because all this kind of depression, madness, perversion, even going towards the self-destruction, in the sense of like mentally, or the interrelationships between all the individuals in the society. So humankind is part of nature, but we seek development at the cost of nature. But mankind is also a social animal and a product of social relations. And that back the time of Plato, they were talking about that human beings is a social animal. So thus they are also a political animals. But it was human beings are supposed to be a social animal. But since the modernity of capitalism, people are getting more and more alienated, and with growing hostility, also causing all kinds of damage to the social relationships, interhuman relationships, kinships, mutual trust, etc. People saw that they already find the self, and they were trying to liberate the self, and also talking about the freedom and the liberation. But it is this kind of extension of individuality under the name of freedom or human rights. They were talking about all these kind of slogans, like about freedom, becomes, it is this kind of promised land, or this kind of modernity, talking about all kinds of rights. All kinds of rights are, again, is name, and they were talking about with the rights people can gain the liberation. which in the end resulted to the void of the modern human beings mentality, and even the source of perversion and madness. Yes, for a long time, some serious thinkers and intellectuals have been reflecting on this paradox of modernity, because modernity in itself is a paradox. Lots of thinkers have published and have written a lot of writings on this topic, not only just Marx but ironically, at least from what we can observe, partly is because with the disintegration of the Soviet Union in such a way that is very abrupt and self-claimed defeat, partly because along with this disintegration, there is another kind of self-deceiving, the so-called victory of the freedom and democracy, especially the short-lived Americans. It's really short-lived, this kind of a hegemony of America, which means that you can do whatever you want. So it is this kind of these reasons, people seem to forget that since the birth of the modernity originated from the West, this self-absurdity or self-contradictions critics have been marginalized, or just become like very limited amount of discussion among a few students in the classroom. Once it possessed the force to organize people into production, into social movements, now it is stopped, paused, or delayed. On the contrary, this constantly distorting self and this so-called freedom are taken as a new discursive hegemony and so-called political correctness, including in West Europe, America, where this kind of modernity was from, because that is exactly because it was from there. Now all this kind of talks, this kind of critiques has just become a casual talk. But this modernity was proclaimed as a universal value. But I believe any kind of existence, if it spends a longer time, covers a wider space, and includes more individuals, then at least most likely the more universality it implies. I know it might be a bit abstract, but I have been talking about this for more than 10 years, but I haven't received any critiques, because this is like I would call this just almost like a law, because as long as any kind of existence, if it spends a longer time, covers a wider space, and includes more individuals, then at least most likely the more universality it implies. So strictly speaking, the capitalist modernity, starting, if you want to count from the resonance, yes, it has only been applied to a small population and a limited area, started a kind of production, a kind of way of production. So it only lasted 300 to 500 years. How can it become universal? How come there's no alternative to it? And also, and on another well, since the PRC was started since the PRC started, we always talking about that we cannot just copy, we cannot just repeat what the production model of other places. So now the problem actually is more and more clear. It's not just about whether if it is suitable, this modernity is suitable to be adapted to or transplanted to other areas or cultures, but in its own region where it was originated, even in the era, its own universality or universalism has problem. Because like earlier I talked about the external cost, it already exclude the cost of the nature, of the mentality, of the mutual assistance, mutual help between human beings, and also the whole social, moral, ethics. At this cost, if you calculate it through this way, this kind of organization is going towards self-destruction at an accelerating speed. So I know it sounds a bit pessimistic, but we are always talking about we are supposed to be optimistic, because is it only for human beings that have to see the end of the day, they have to see the doom day, then they will start to rethink. Does the human beings won't respond until it is too late? Or China has found a way for its own development. We call it the development with Chinese characteristics, and also it's trying to give to the other countries an alternative way, an alternative mode. And when we're talking about civilization, China has been discussing about this kind of mutual construction between civilizations. While civilization is already legitimate, as long as it already survived till today, that's my opinion. But no matter how ancient, it is not that only an ancient civilization can have the right to survive. No, we are talking about this self-construction between civilizations. And I also believe that the human beings won't wait till it is too late before they could start to rethink about our way of life, the institution, and also what's behind it, the dignity, the confidence, the trust and kinship, along with the mutual support with the nature. And this is what I would like to talk about. 45 minutes. Thank you. This is the much I would like to discuss. Thank you. Now I would like to hear some replies or comments.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Huang. Actually, you only spoke for 32 minutes, so yes. Not 45 minutes. Well, so Professor Huang has, before the lecture, said that he will transfer the remaining minutes to Professor Dai. So Professor Dai, with your own 15 minutes plus the 30 minutes from Professor Huang, you can speak up to 45 minutes. But then maybe let me just say a few words about what Professor Huang just said. Professor Huang just now argued for kinships and communities as the basis for social relationships, rather than having the atomized individual as the center of the universe. And he critiques this paradox of modernity with his propositions of the so-called autonomous self and universal human rights. And he calls for reasserting the specificity of the non-West countries. So now we will be hearing from Professor Dai Jinhua. Professor Dai, please. Professor Dai, no, let me introduce Professor Dai. Professor Dai Jinhua is a leading feminist cultural critic in China. She is professor in the Institute of Comparative Literature and Culture and director of the Center for Film and Cultural Studies at Peking University. Her research interests include popular culture, film studies, and gender studies. She is the author of many books, including Invisible Writing, Cultural Studies in China in the 1990s, Breaking Out of the Mirror City, Cinema and Desire, Masked Night, The Writings of Subcommander Marcos, After the Post-Cold War, The Future of Chinese History, among others. Her works have been translated into English, French, German, Italian, Spanish, Japanese, and Korean. Her literary, film, and TV commentary addresses a large audience in China. So now over to you, Professor Dai.
Thank you, Huang Ping. Thank you, Huang Ping, for accepting me as a discussant. Still, I would like to say that, Huang, you are still the most optimistic among us. You still believe that we have a choice. You still believe that China is continuing to create and trying to find such choices. If I have time, I would like to invite Professor Huang to elaborate more or respond to me about the Southern China economy. Before the pandemics, in 2019, I spent a few days in Suzhou, a city in that area. It used to strike me as a small and delicate pre-modern Chinese city that features gardens, Asian Chinese gentlemen, and a culture of being educated and engaging in agriculture. When I had more time to explore this city, however, I was told that the size of the city is 10 to 15 times what it used to be, and it has become the most important industrial base of southern China. My friends there told me when they were in a shopping center, there was a big plaza, a square outside, and there are some very internationalized young people. And a local friend says that the land beneath our feet used to be cropland or fishing ponds that used to be the most typical village area of southern China. And now, however, it's a modern metropolis of modern infrastructure, modern skyscrapers, and modern industrial parks. If Professor Huang has time, I hope he can talk about where locates the southern China economy that is still supported by agriculture and the system designed behind it. I myself would very much like to learn about how our experiment with urban-rural integration is going. Because in my part, what I see is quite concerning. Because of this integration and the marketization of land, the commercialization and industrialization of land, accompanied by the waste of lands being laid as waste. In Hunan and Hubei, both provinces, I've seen that cropland what used to be cropland are now wasteland with weeds that grow as tall as my waist. And in this process, some peasants enjoy cash because of this land marketization, and urbanized residents, they seem to be enjoying a relatively easy and rich life. A conversation with an elderly surprised me in some way. What this feeling had first strike me with something written by Professor Huang and also by Professor Chen Xi, another scholar, a kind of generation gap in traditional Chinese culture. The traditional way of life, traditional values, and traditional civilization represented by the elderly. By the 1990s, it had already been destroyed by consumerism that came as powerful as a flood or as an avalanche. These elderly do not criticize the young people for leaving the rural area and migrate to cities to work as migrant workers. Instead, they say they envy. They're envious of these young people, say that they happen to have be born in a good era. And then I go back to what I talked about, this land marketization of rural area. And some peasants now are able to have a few modern apartments, be able to buy a good car, and they don't have much to do. And I ask one of the elderly, what about your children and your children's children? And this elderly being interviewed said, I cannot go to that far, I don't care that far. So this is a kind of different perspective of viewing Southern China involution. It's a negative example. It shows how modernity has influenced or even destroyed Chinese rural area. Well, something less relevant. I sometimes go to the film museum in Beijing, and each time I will see a thing, that is the public parking lots and even public roads have been occupied by medium level or even more luxurious brands of automobiles. There used to be farmlands or residence lands that have been marketed into commercial lands. They belong to farmers who used to own these lands. They also own these expensive automobiles, but they do not have place to park their cars, so they park their cars outside this film museum. And then from another perspective that is very personal, about that self as perspective, as we all know, from within we can feel that, and from without we can observe that. From this year on, big cities in China like Beijing and Shanghai have been struck by COVID-19, and also we are having public health measures and policies. And in China, when some residential areas face local lockdown, I see a phenomenon where I can see from the apps on my phone, my younger friends that are in contact with me. When we see that when we face a more serious situation, so they need to hoard up some food products. Like they need a big freezer so that we can have more vegetables to keep them longer. Under such circumstances, I see young people are showing what they have stored up in their fridges. Three of them were quite common that surprised me. One of them was that they bought a lot of ingredients of Chinese cuisine, and they also buy a lot of ingredients of Western cuisine, because they say for some time, I may not leave my home. So now we can have a delicate lifestyle where I can cook very delicate cuisine myself. The second from some even younger friends of mine, some show off that they have, look, I have 15 different kind of drinks, soft drinks. The most prominent of them is sugar-free, zero Coke, because it used to be the best merchandise during the lockdown in Shanghai. And then garbage food. So they say, oh, now we begin a larger time. And for the third category of them show a lot of equipment for surviving in the wild, where they can be able to subsist under hard circumstances without any modern guarantee of life. When faced with this potential local lockdown, different ways of reaction from different young people demonstrates basically that more than urban youth in China, it seems that for them they cannot imagine starvation or imagine being deprived, or they cannot imagine a so-called quote-unquote normal life, and what they need for this kind of continuity of a normal life. We're already used to take out food or food delivery, where you can get well-cooked food within 20 minutes. And everything is occurring on the presumption that you have endless choices. We're also used to a world that is connected by logistic networks and the internet. Everything is just about the acquisition and expansion and expenditure of money. So, but what is production? What is living? What is subsistence? What is society? What is the organic nature of our society? All these does not seem to be something within our daily system of feeling of sensitivity. So back to modernity, all these lifestyles, they are not just the continuity of the separation of human beings from the nature of modernism and human beings' deprivation and exploitation of nature. It is not simply a continuity of this. Even they can no longer feel that we human beings is part of nature, that they depend on the supplies from nature to survive. Once I served as a judge of a university student drama festival. I rated a very interesting play, a very low score, because it described that, it said that children's dream is to have a mountain of ice cream. And then they happily discovered that that mountain, that ice cream mountain that cannot be found in their fridges at home can be found in supermarkets. In other words, food that serves our subsistence come from supermarkets instead of from the land, to such a degree that they cannot feel the working people, the laborers. We cannot feel the producers of materials to such an extent that they can no longer feel that no matter how well we develop, still the relationship between the farmer and the land is the most essential element of human existence, let alone that they need to reflect on or all our lifestyles and our ways of production has a connection with nature, with Mother Earth, and with the whole ecosystem. So in this regard, I think Professor Huang talked about both the self and the ecology. And this is a very inspiring path for thought. When we talk about ecology, we're bound to talk about human beings, and not in the abstract sense, but the human society. However, no matter how great an environmentalist they can be, or how much they reflect on the human-centric thoughts, they talk about ecology because they are prioritizing the existence and survival of human beings. And it is our hope that this human race continues. And the prerequisite for this continuity is that the earth still is applicable as a space for survival for human beings. When I was given this opportunity by Kin Chi to talk at the beginning of this forum, I talked about something that made me, that upset me, that made me feel powerless. It's some of my own observation. That is, if we say that human beings today are living in a illusion of civilization that has been promised by modernity, by Western civilization, this saying is not very accurate. It's not that they are no longer able to judge, to reflect, to criticize, and to change the world. This is not too accurate. If it's accurate enough, then they wouldn't have such relevant cultural facts. What I saw was that a discovery of astronomy was being celebrated around the world. That is, we've finally discovered a planet that is suitable for human survival, for human living. These scientists finally discovered a planet where human suitable for human life, and it become a headline around the world. People are celebrating and heatedly talking about this fact. In my opinion, there are a lot of such news, and it means that to some degree, we know that our way of life, our way of production, our design of system, the construction of our civilization is not sustainable. It's not only that, it's not sustainable. Into this new century, we feel we're having a countdown. It feels very real.
And also people start to perceive this kind of and understand or share this kind of worry. That's why I use the term of the awareness of a so-called subconscious awareness, because people knows, but they don't want to know. Why they don't want to know? Because they accept such a judgment, which is there is no alternative. We don't have a choice, and we don't have any other possibilities. There's no way for us to have any institutional, social, or individual way of surviving. It's not that we don't know that a society with kinship, with mutual understanding, mutual assistance is good, but we don't know how to get there. We don't know how to return to that. We don't know how to fight for it or how to construct it. The loss of this kind of organicity of the society, at least to what I have observed, it's It's the society after the Cold War started this phase of or so-called unpolitical, because now the politics just belongs to the elites. It's not belong to every member of the earth. It doesn't belong to any human beings that care for their own welfare or their further generations or the future of the earth, the future of the humankind. Originally, the politics is the topic discussed by all, enjoyed by all, shared by all. But now we are in this kind of atomized society. Needless to say, I know most of the audience know this already. In this kind of individual atomized existence, it's also using an unseen force to reinforce the dependence of the individual on the society. So the lockdown and pandemic will result in so-called hunger or starvation. The reason lies in that many people that depend on the social network that is organized by the capitals. Once this social network lost its own supply chain, now the individuals cannot live to the living standards, because in our modernized home, there is no food that is from the last meal. We don't have the food that is necessary for our survival. When we are told to store some extra food, what we store is the Coca-Cola, the beef jerky, etc. So that's why I say, on this sense, when we are thinking about ecology, it is never just a question of ecology. When we are thinking about individuals, it's also never just a question of individuality. So when we put these two topics together, ecology and individuals, now we have a question. When they're putting together, the question must be social, political, and also how we can think up an alternative, or to create an alternative in face of the capitalism. So once all, I know that the correct way to express should be alternatives in plural form. But sometimes I deliberately say that we need an alternative to capitalism. We need an imagination of the collective. We need to find, in front of the urgent, imminent crisis, we need to find a consensus so that we can generate courage to face those facts that we know but we don't want to face. I once had a talk with a science fiction writer. We had some exchange online, and our purification lies in whether we should save the earth, or we should try to develop as fast as possible the technology, space technology, so that we can find a planet where the human beings can live. I know this is a topic that is very abstract and very superstitious, very metaphysics, because I insist on that we only have one, there is only one Earth, and we need to save this one. Further question that is, if there is a habitable planet, do we want to go there and use another 500 or 1,000 years to destroy it? A more important question is, do we have enough? Do we have all the technology to transfer all the human beings, all the population, all the living things in this earth to the another? So the most important question is not whether if the human beings can survive, but human beings as a community, the majority, can we have a tomorrow? And every one of us, how can we get rid of this alienation and to stand up? Earlier, Huang Ping says that the involution is the alias of the so-called lifelet, but actually the other way around is because the young people now is in this kind of involution situation, so they choose to lifelet so that they don't have to fight in this all of this competitiveness. This year, when I was talking with the graduate of the Peking University, I said I refuse to lifelet. Let's try with our own feet. That there are lots of roads on this world that we can try to explore. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dai. You took only 25 minutes, so there's a lot of time that we have for the discussions and also for our interactions later. So just now, Professor Dai gave us an account of the encroachment of industrialization and urbanization on the rural, including the rural communities in China. And she described the alienation of humans from nature, not only materially, but also in affect, in our incapacity to relate to our habitat and to nature. When the many manifestations of human conditions are unsustainable, so why is it that we do not find a way to fight for the desirable organic society? And she calls for alternatives to capitalism. So we will, and she also posed quite a few questions for Professor Huang Ping. But before we invite Professor Huang Ping to respond, I would first want to invite Professor Lee Jung-Ok as discussant. So Professor Lee is Emeritus Professor of Daegu Catholic University in South Korea. She previously served as Minister of Gender Equality and Family under President Moon Jae-in from 2019 to 2020. She is a senior advisor and ex-president of the Korean Association of NGO Studies. She was the co-chair of Gender Equality Committee of Ministry of National Defense, co-president of Women's Forum for Peace and Diplomacy, and chair of International Cooperation Committee of Korea Democracy Foundation. She is a former member and chair of Public Interest Activity Promotion and Committee of Seoul Metropolitan Government. So the floor is yours, Professor Lee.
I am more focused on modernity and so modernity in general, and the modernity and the colonialism and the self and community. That is the topic that I want to share. So I thought the modernity, there is a self, there are two kinds of self. One is the I, and the other is me. So me is, I borrow the concept of George Herbert Mead. So the me is more reflective self. I is more some kind of unregulated self. So that is the main concept I want to share. So let's go down quickly. Next. So I thought usually we use the modernization is a historical process, as already Professor Wang Ping has introduced, is a very short time period of Western experience. So, mostly economically characterized by capitalization. Sometimes it is translated as industrialization when we emphasize more technological advance rather than class issue. So, and then politically, the starting of nation state, so it is different from the other Asian culture. We do have a long history of our dynasty of nation state, but in Western part, they reinvent nation state through modernization. So that is the difference. And culturally more secularization. So liberated from faith and the superstition and some kind of God. So that is the historical process in Western society. So it is modernization. Go down. Next, please. So, so we should differentiate the concept of modernization and the concept of modernity. So the concept of modernity was constructed. So there are many contents, but we usually understand it. Individualism, universal value, as Professor Wang Ping has emphasized, and the developmentalism, urbanism, and meritocracy, and the bureaucracy, etc. So there are many kinds of modernity. Whatever they want, they coinize the modernity as their own way. So go next. So next. So then after constructing modernity, the modernization theory in the field of sociology has been developed as a policy guideline for developing countries. So the Korea is some kind of a very model country for the success of so-called modernization theory-based development strategy. So in this kind of, so I do differentiate the modernization and constructed modernity, and based on that the modernization theory for the developing countries. And then in this category, modernity became a goal, and there is the characterization of a modern man has been invented, and there are many social scientists have focused on measurement of modernity. So that go next. So through this basis, the construction of modernity lead to hierarchization of cultures. So so based on the modernity, all the countries or all the sectors can be measured by the criteria of modernity. So economically efficiency-based, and how much integrated into capital market, and politically, so parliament system, rule of law, election system. It is a kind of politics of majority, and culturally, mostly competition and achievement. So that can be a measure. So it has socialized and surrounded our mind and self and the society also. Okay, cool. Next slide, please. Yeah. So I thought as a modernity as a historical process, so modernization process, they allow diverse spaces. So it is not linear and open to reflections of modernization process. But I think China tried to make a Chinese characterization of development that is related with more focusing on historical process emphasis. But some modernity combined with the colonialism, most of the concept, the modernity sometimes misunderstood as westernization, and nationalism can be against westernization, the universal value versus a traditional value. So most of the concept deviated from historical context. So in that sense, so the modernity combined with the colonialism, they are in a deadlock in certain way. Yeah. Next. So in this situation, I thought most of the country who searched for modernization combined with the colonialism, that in simultaneity of insimultaneousities. So the coexistence of pre-modern, modern, and postmodern. But sometimes if we find a better part of the three, it is a better way, but usually the worst part of the combination is the realities. Okay. So usually, because of this, the modernization combined with the colonialism, they have easily agreed the economic development. It is quite visible, but the behind the social and the political development usually been lagged out. So next, please. So it is like that. So the older, especially the social resources, family tradition and the community tradition, those are mobilized for the supporting of economic development. I sometimes it became almost dried out for supporting overdeveloped and accelerated economic development. So in this situation, so we are questioning about the sustainability of so-called modernization. Go next. Next slide, please. Yeah, and there are many deformation of concept. They are arbitrary understanding of concept, especially freedom. It was been already explained by Professor Wang Ping. So in Korean context, it is usually understood as the deregulation and the privatization. So free use of public resources or something, and individualism, more right orientation, and negligence of responsibility. And the tradition has been allowed under the name of tradition has allowed the nepotism and the patriarchy rather than cooperation. So and the human right also very segmented, and there is no universal criteria. It is quite a zero-sum game. So sometimes labor right, women's right, right to peace, and the right to culture, right to development are in competition. Okay. So because of that, within the modernity, the self and the community, the individual are more isolated, and the family is one of the basic infra of a community, but now the family became an ideology. So and this integration of a community. Go next. Next slide, please. So the isolated individual, I think the I is unregulated greed and on the freedom of choice. This was constructed by consumerism. So I is not isolated, it is also constructed. And me is a cooperative self within community. So the I has increased and the me became diminished. So that is the current situation. Next slide. So the modern family, so love marriage is quite emotional, and the parent-children relationship is inheritance by lineage and the status orientation. So it cannot go with the modernity, because modernity, efficiency and the calculation. So this kind of a more emotional and the more the status background cannot go with the modern society. So we can see the many of disintegration of a family. There's a lot of divorce rate, and there are various kinds of families. So the traditional type of family has drastically changed. Okay. So I cannot suggest any alternatives, but right now, so we cannot believe in universal value under the UN system. So limitation of a global community, and nation state cannot change their orientation of modernization process and the modernity orientation. So because of within those kind of limitation, we should create our own locality. So that is my vague suggestion. Okay, next slide. So it is more closer than construction of locality is more closer. Global means the like a South-South forum more going beyond the national boundaries. Next slide. So it is you can see the reconstruction of a communal tradition. So it cannot be done by alone. So it is more solidarity building and reconfirmation among the like-minded community. So based on that, we can create some locality. So rather than, so I want to change the modernity, replace modernity with the locality. Next slide. So even our students who are mostly urbanized and consumeristic, they nowadays they do visit a small community, and they make their own effort and activities like not like the scale of a rural reconstruction movement, but very small and partial scale of those kind of community building activities, very active. So we try to bridge them and let them think about it in a more bigger context. Okay, next slide. So I think the construction of the locality, it is reconstruction of inclusive cooperative tradition and the deconstruction of exclusiveness toward external groups. So that is the one of the thing we should in mind. Okay. So, and because we want to see the within the tradition, within the communal life, there is a good part and some kind of more exclusive part. So and sometimes our greedy self are unregulated. So sometimes we need some kind of adequate regulation. So for those kind of creation of localities, we need some kind of I was very impressed by Professor Wang Ping's universality, construction of a university based on longevity and widespread commonly understanding. So that was very very creative reconceptualization of universalism. So as a based, we know where to go, but but we need how. But South Forum is the one venue for us to go there. Thank you for understanding. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Lee. And so we've heard Professor Lee talk about the perspective from Korea about modernity and also modernization. So now we would like to invite Professor Manoranjan MOHANTY to speak to us. Professor MOHANTY was a professor of political science and director of the Developing Countries Research Center at the University of Delhi, where he taught comparative politics, Chinese politics, and research methodology. Currently, he is a distinguished professor at the Council for Social Development in New Delhi, where until recently, he edited the CSD-SAGE journal, Social Change. He is a social scientist, China scholar, and a peace and human rights activist with research interest in the study of political economy of China, India, and global transformation. He is an emeritus fellow of the Institute of Chinese Studies, is founding member and is former chairperson. He is also the emeritus chairperson of Development Research Institute in Bhubaneswar, the research wing of Gabashana Chakra, of which he was the founder president. So over to you, Professor MOHANTY.
Thank you. It has been an extraordinary month of really a festival of creative possibilities. You know, this session is an example of that, and tomorrow we'll have more. And when we look back at this 5-week and more, we feel that there is hope in the future of the planet and its beings. By the way, Professor Lee, me, some of us in India, we call it the abbreviation of Mother Earth. So me is Mother Earth. So there is some hope after listening to so many of you all these evenings. I'm really excited about today's session as well. And Professor Wang Ping's formulations on the crisis that you know, modernity has posed to the human civilization, and the discourse on the self, and Professor Tai Jinhua's extremely powerful argument about the reality on the ground and the formidable trends which we are witnessing in China and all over the world, very much in India and also all over the world. And Professor Lee, I thank you for really summarizing the knowledge on the subject and giving an extremely useful perspective how we can see some space in our concept of relating global with local, what you call locality. Now, this moment, I will define in terms of today's discussion, recording 3 elements of a new civilizational movement going on in the world today. In fact, in world history, we have periods of civilizational movement affecting the entire planetary civilization. And we have to understand this present phase of the civilizational movement in the world. And in fact, the call of this South-South Forum each time, and especially this time after so many challenges of COVID, the war, and the climate crisis, and so many other problems, is that we have to take part in this civilizational movement. So there are 3 transitions which are taking place, and we have to record them. First, from Europe to the world. And this transition has a great meaning from colonialism to liberation in terms of not only the Industrial Revolution, which enabled Europe to colonize the rest of the world, most of the rest of the world, but also the cosmology that accompanied that industrialization, the cosmology which Professor Wang Ping and before him, yesterday, for example, the culture of agriculture in China, all these 5,000 years that Professor Chang was talking about, and many others. Professor Wan Tei-chun has been talking about this. So this transition from colonialism, because it has also meant from colonial modernity to liberation-oriented or liberation-centric transformation. If you don't want to use the term modernity or some substitute for it, let us use the word transformation. So the liberatory transformation that liberates us from so many bondages which European colonialism carried with it. And please remember, that was going on even after liberation in China, independence of India, or in Latin America, in Africa, and so on. Because our elites, through education, through institutions built by colonialism, were made to feel that the only path to liberation is after you get power to rebuild also European city kind of urban spaces, European kind of industries, European kind of technology, European kind of social science, European kind of laboratories in technology, European infrastructure. So when I see a Times Square in Peking or a Times Square in Delhi or in Rio de Janeiro, I'm appalled. These are symbols of reproduction of colonial modernity and whatever goes with it. So that is one. And please remember, this transition carries a cosmology, view of history, of the world, of the origin of species, evolution of species, everything. Culture very much. So that cosmology is still binding us. All our great universities of China and India have collaborations with European and American universities. And we together rebuild and recreate and recycle and develop these cosmology. I'm a party to this. I think like Professor Wang Ping, me, so many others, we have been visiting professors. We have had colleagues as visiting professors. We have had many joint projects with European scholars and so on. So that's one. The second transition, why I call it a transition? Because we now recognize it. A South-South Forum, a Bandung Spirit Network, and so many such. And there are so many smaller things in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and even alternative fora in the West connected with these changes. They know that this is unsustainable. European colonial modernity is unsustainable for the reasons that have been explained so well throughout this forum. The second transition which is taking place, and today, in fact, Professor Wan Tei-chun talks about it in great length, and so many in this forum have talked about it, and some are working on this, and that is the transition from human-centric socio-economic political process to M-E, Mother Earth, or planetary or ecological social, political, economic process, where nature is at the center, from anthropomorphic to Anthropocene, from, European cosmology created the definition of modernity as conquest of nature through science, through technology, I was really enjoying when Professor Jinhua was referring to this discovery of the other planet or the new galaxy, which was also identified. This conquest of nature by the humans. The great telescope in Switzerland, the multi-country effort, the space station which Russia and US built may be running into problems now, but actually the dominant path of development of Russia, even under Putin, and most of our countries, as well as the US or EU, are the same. So there will be joint space stations in the future and similar things in the future. But that change, that transition is now recognized. It is taking place. COVID exposed the COVID-19, this pandemic, 2 years, which is still continuing actually. And in India, the cases are rising. Just as in many countries in Europe and America, once again, the cases are rising. So COVID exposed the non-viability of that human-centric development process or economic social process. I know, that a little exchange the other day on development we had, and Kin Chi very clearly stated that I totally agree with that. But this is what our elites are doing in all the countries, including China and India. So that is the second transition, the human-centric to planetary consciousness all over the world, and more people are doing this. And the third transition is the transition from atomistic, self-centric notion of collective. And this collective may be society, maybe state, maybe the world market. But it begins with the atomistic individual, the competitive individual. This is the notion that Enlightenment in Europe gave, that European cosmology produces this notion of the self. We are rejecting that. And all of us, Professor Wang Ping, Professor Jinhua, and Professor Lee, beautifully, trying to extricate and recover another concept of not I, but me. She said, me in community. In fact, self is only a relational self. There is nothing else. Self is member of a family, member of a group, member of a linguistic group, member of a production group, member of a class, member of a gender, member of so many identities. Self is definitionally a relationship. And therefore, that relational notion of self as against the atomistic individual has to grapple with a new concept of layers of collectivities, right from the grassroots to the global level. This is why the Indian concept of Swa in Swaraj is so important. I think, when you, this Zhu in Chinese, or so many Swa, or, the concept of this self in Ubuntu, in Bienvivir, so many of our African and Latin American friends have talked about this, is very different. It is relational, it is in community, it is in relevant context. You see? Therefore, that self-determination, self-realization, self-fulfillment always is a relational togetherness in fulfillment. That transition is taking place. This is the third great transition. The three-sum transition is the new civilizational movement that the South-South Forum today records. That so many of us in different forums, our Bandung group, Bandung Spirit Network, in which most of us here present are members, records that. We rebel against that capitalist notion of the atomistic self, which has been at the root of neoliberal capitalist globalization, reaffirmed during the last 30 years all over the world. All our elites are promoting that ideology all over the world. I know my time is getting up. Two other points I will make about the discursive hegemony that all three of you, and particularly, well, several of you have talked about. And the tragedy is, we are speaking in English and we have to use these terms. So there are some linguistic constraints. It's very difficult to turn English language into only an instrument of communication and not a philosophy. We know, and philosophers of language, Chomsky and others have told us, language is also politics. Expression is politics. And discourse theory has taught us that also. But we should be conscious. I think consciously, we have to pick up new language and have in our own languages all discourses. Yes, English should only be the translation source. And but our training, my training in India, I'm a more efficient speaker in English than in my Odia language, and much less in Hindi, my wider nationwide spoken language, and so on, because of our training, which colonial education prevailed over us. So fight the discursive hegemony. Therefore, when we collaborate with our Western professor colleagues, and we are all members of so many chat groups and collaborative projects and so on, I think the complexity of the discourse has to be exposed at every moment. And therefore, this is why I'm so happy that the Global University is producing literature. I think much more literature, print literature, not only other visual literature. Visual literature is very important. I think print literature and having great minds like Jinhua and Wang Hui from literature and many others as members. Unfortunately, from other countries, we don't have many literature people. We must bring language and literature people into South-South Forum. They are the greatest communicators, and they are the first victims of state repression in India today. I can tell you. Many of us are, envious of the kind of impact that our literature friends, poets particularly, have on our masses. So fight discursive hegemony. This is my second point. My final point is about the rights. Bourgeoisie has given such a narrow definition of rights, and the English literature has conveyed the rights discourse from liberal theory to the rest of the world so effectively that many of us, and a group of Marxists included, have dismissed rights. Sorry, rights are not claims recognized by the state. The liberal notion of rights. Rights are assertions of conditions, desirable conditions, political conditions, which are products of people's struggles. They are political affirmations. They get into law, but law is not the absolute guarantor of rights. Law sometimes limits rights, and you have to overcome the law. It still is located in struggles. Rights are products of people's struggles. right to independence, right to liberation, right to gender equality, right to all the liberal rights to begin with, were the products of revolution, French Revolution and so on. Therefore, rights are political affirmations which are continuously evolving through struggle, and they have to be pursued through struggle. So please don't hand over the rights discourse to the hegemonies, the capitalist hegemonies. They have done enough damage by restricting rights discourse to the liberal theory of rights. I'm a member of the People's Union for Democratic Rights. For 40 years, we have been fighting. And there are so many Marxists who are members of our group, Marxists as well as some radical liberals. And Rajni Kothari was a sympathizer, though he was in the PUCL with whom we had broken. But he tried to make PUCL like PUDR. This definition of rights, People's Union for Democratic Rights. Okay, so rights are not what liberal capitalists define it as. That is part of the discursive hegemony of rights. We have to give the people's rights definition of rights as products of struggle and continuously contribute to the new definition of rights. So only then Swaraj, Ubuntu, Bien Vivir, HUANG will create a new planetary civilization. There is a civilizational movement, and the last 300's hegemony has been broken. It is challenged, though our elites are persisting that, but we know, and during the 2 years of COVID, it has been exposed beyond redemption. You know, the migrant labor story in India and China, particularly in India, and all over the world, the casual worker story, exposed the worst of capitalist political economy. And therefore, to really reassert labor's assertion of rights, that those who work, those who labor, they create civilization. Not like class society, slave society, or capitalist society, which graded labor and degraded agricultural economy. We reject gradation and degradation of labor and economies. We have a new definition of production and civilizational progress. So with that hope, let me conclude. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Mohanty. Just now, at the beginning of the session, we were arguing who is the more optimistic person among all the speakers, and it seems Professor Mohanty is the champion. Despite his account of the many problems facing us, he still uncovers positive possibilities. While Gustavo Esteve reiterates the indigenous philosophy of every I is a we, Professor Mohanty gives a new interpretation to me, M-E, which is Mother Earth. And he calls for a new language to be created. And he gives a lot of importance to poets and literary persons. And I think his optimism lies in the fact that he could see the struggles of the ordinary people for their livelihood. And he could see the reciprocity and solidarity among the people. And he says, we should not hand over the discourse of rights to the elites, but then, or the neoliberals, we should be taking those in our own hands. So now we have heard from our three eminent discussants. And now I would like to first have this round of discussions among our four panelists. So Professor Huang Ping, would you like to respond to the three discussants, please?
I'd like to thank all of the three distinguished discussants for their very enlightened points. To those, I have no more sort of disagreement with them. I enjoy their sort of more than just comments. sometimes also discussions. And I think in principle, we shared a lot amongst ourselves. Even some terms we use is almost the same. Even when I gave my sort of presentation in Chinese, but I think I use, for instance, such terms like locality or community building or rebuilding, which Professor Li has talked so much and in more than just in theory. And for also such issues like the importance of the new language or discourse, which I strongly feel even increasingly so critical. That's also very much the very reason Kin Chi and I and some others recently had, actually after more than almost 3 decades efforts, we did this kind of a first step forward. I hope there will be second, third, and we can continue on this so-called transculturality, which this time we had this with the European colleagues, but actually we have had also similar interactions between scholars in Asia, between scholars in Asia and Africa, and even Latin America, how different cultures, even sometimes we have to use, or seemingly we use the same language such as English, or same terms, such from society, state, to people, to a community. In terms of the discourse, not only definition of the terms, but in terms of the discourse, we have to go beyond this kind of Eurocentric sort of use of the language, either originally from English or other European languages. Thirdly, it's not really much to say we are optimistic or not, or pessimistic, but rather because of such challenges, problems, crises, we have to think of alternative thinking, alternative to modernity or to so-called Western capitalist modernity. There are many such sort of very rich intellectual sources out of Europe, but because of the domination of the European discourse, those are either ignored or forgotten. Such as the term, of course, in the past we used mostly in China, Xiaokang, but actually borrowed from the very ancient Chinese society. And there is a more important term such as 大同 as alternative to the capitalist modernity. I think 大同 was something like a communism, but it's still like a great community or greatest community, something like this. We share, the greatest community we share. This is the 大同, for instance. So ecologically, I think at least if we have to still use the European language, if we can combine something like ecological socialism. In China, we use 生态文明, the ecological socialism, which on the one side, we have to, it's not sort of very human-centered, but rather this kind of sustainability to develop, not sustainable development, but sustainability as alternative to develop. This is ecology. The socialism is a alternative to sort of very self-centered modernity, which actually brings about crisis after crisis. Thirdly, as to Dai Jinhua's comments, we have known each other for decades. I knew what she and you have all tried to say by challenging, but seemingly challenging me, but actually I knew very much about what you meant. But if I rather exactly because what you have described, either in Suzhou, in China today or yesterday, that's exactly why I argue this kind of so-called capitalist modernity is rather like a social cancer, which spreads all over the world, including China, including Suzhou, including the rural, traditional rural community or society. As I said, this has even been rapid in such a way that we have no time, or it's too late to rethink, to regret, and to respond to it. But again, as you have mentioned, the Chen Xin's thesis, Chen Xin was actually my first PhD student. He has retired already, and his thesis was exactly part of my research program in those years in the 1980s. I have launched something called study of consumerism, but the consumerism is like one side of the capitalism. So in terms of production, you use the capital. In terms of consumption, you use the consumerism. So the one coin of the two sides of the one coin, and which also showed how not only rapid but how serious this kind of spread of this social cancer to such a society with long tradition, long history, even socialist sort of revolution, peasant revolution, sort of self-reliance, all of those efforts. But still you can see this kind of challenge to all of us. That's why I very much agree with all of you. It's so important to have South-South sort of forum and South-South university. They also have the new language, new discourse, so therefore to rethink before it's too late. And it's already, in terms of three dimensions, as Dai Jinhua has pointed out, not only just a problem of ecology, nor just a problem of self, but a problem of institutionalization, industrialization, as Professor Li has showed to us, the industrialization of everything, including even violence. That has to be all. Yeah. Therefore, we have to see how, but it's never say we should never say never. So we still have to be sort of fighting against this, all of this. Even it's, as I say, it sounds pessimistic, but I say that human beings are such animals which has destroyed our environment for survival. But actually, in order to survive, we damage the environment for survival. That's a very sort of very dilemma. But the capitalist modernity or Western or European modernity was the engine to really damage everywhere, every corner of the society, every dimension. Therefore, it has to be a comprehensive alternative to the problem, rather than just technologically. Even when you, in practice, to deal with it, you have to be maybe one by one, maybe from one dimension to another. But in terms of this philosophical and socio-political thinking, it has to be a comprehensive, sophisticated, and sort of a whole holistic approach. Maybe I should stop here at the moment and see what more. I saw there are also questions from the audience, and later on I will see if I should have time to respond. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you,
the questions from the audience will come in the second round. So
yeah,
this is the first round, the discussions among the panelists. So now we would like to invite Professor Dai Jinhua to join the discussions.
Professor Dai, the floor is yours. The only thing I want to respond to is that I've known Professor Huang for 30 years. But he said that I've only known me for 10 years. No, I said 30. But 30 years, the 30 years of criticism of modernism, of capitalism and alternatives. And these are the topics that brought us together. And today, I believe the problem is not with whether we should be optimistic or pessimistic, but it's about what to do and how to do that and do it immediately.
I'd like to invite Professor Lee Jung-Ok. How would you like to respond to the other panelists?
I try to share our pessimistic optimism. So, and a very sharp description of Professor Jinhua of current situation among the young generation. So they are very much detached from the real nature and production. So that was very much the same in Korea. So according to Marxist analysis, when we see in Europe, there is a consumer movement. They usually emphasize for the consumers, try to monitor and see the production process. So try to more closer linkage of production process is the more progressive consumer movement orientation, as far as I understand. So in Korea, we also try to do that, but because of all, but students are so much obsessed with the status attainment, and their schedule is so tight. So it is very difficult to organize this kind of events outside this kind of forum. So even though I think your book and many global university faculty members' books, so if it became university textbook, then it will be quite a useful space we can share. But now we are the same generation. We have retired, so I'm checking whether we have our colleague professors who followed our line. So it is almost the university is more hijacked by those kind of more modern, more capitalistic way of knowledge production. So we will think about the role of South-South Forum. How can make it more so-called mainstreamized? So that was my concern. Thank you for your arrangement.
Well, thank you, Professor Lee. So Professor MOHANTY, your turn now.
Well, I on this optimism thing, I have a reputation of being an optimist, though I point out so many dark sides of the reality as it is unfolding, about the struggles we have to identify. I think that is the source of hope. I mean, one point I think which has come up, but only indirectly, how the elites are responding to this crisis. That is a recognition. They're responding it by saying that, look, we are doing this. We are encouraging NGOs to have more emphasis on ecology. And look, we have made these commitments in the Glasgow conference, and so on. And on the day of the 9th August, Indigenous Peoples' Day of the United Nations, all countries, certainly in India, we got statements that, now we have a indigenous woman from my state, Odisha, as the president of India. So we are very proud of it, but as if the indigenous people's rights have been, recognized. Sorry, that has to be exposed, that we have to explain that the development path which our elites, China, India, and so many countries have adopted has a structural logic. This is very important. That structural logic has its own force, own momentum. So no amount of, adjustments, ecological coloring, and so on, unless you change the development path, you can't change the structural logic. And this is why it's very important to recognize the problem, see what is the response of our elites to those problems, but also prepare our ground to strengthen our efforts. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So now I think we can start the round of taking questions from the audience. So I would like Professor Jade to read out the questions in Chinese.
They've collected some questions. First question is posed to Professor Huang Tian. What are the good practical experiences from Chinese rural area in terms of constructing ecological civilization, reconstruction of organic society, and recovery of good traditions? The second question is also to Professor Huang. Can Chinese traditional Confucianist, Buddhist, and Taoist culture traditions be used to stand against Western capitalist modernization? If so, in which aspects? The third one is to Professor Li. What are the traditional agricultural social traditions in South Korea that can be of use for us? And question number 4 is for Professor MOHANTY. Which Indian tradition can be used by civil movements against in terms of anti-colonialist modernization? Well, I'll go to my questions. One has something to do with what Professor Dai said. If we interview people in the rural area, they go to Suzhou, go to rural areas, or go to anywhere. She has touched a lot upon this, about privatization, marketization, commercialization. A euphemism is developmentalism, and a more fair term is capitalism. And currently, more than 600 million population of China are in the rural area, and agriculture is still one of the most important industrial sector in China, and still it covers a lot of, rural area covers a lot of the land in China. Although some cities that used to have more rural area are become totally urbanized. It is more or less the same with India. Even they try to follow the paradigm that is purely capitalist, let alone how much problem that brought by capitalism and industrialism, the deprivation and uncalculated costs in terms of ecology, environment, and that cost to the individual and everything, like all the negative psychological influence to the individual, let alone these. On the whole, Chinese rural area now, well, take myself as an example. Several generations of my family have been living in cities, and even before the Cultural Revolution, my family have been living in urban area for a long time. And the more I engage with the rural area, to the broader rural region, and in terms of this developmentalism or capitalism, the more remote area, the better. the traditions or organic ways of life and production are being kept. Either they were incapable of being more modern, or they were voluntary in trying out their practices to maintain more or less their traditional way. Second of all, because of all these impacts on rural area, both the agrochemicals or the big corporations and their exploitation of the rural area and rural community. Because of this incentivized us to have this rural revitalization, rural rejuvenation process. It is a struggle against them, and it is what incentivized us to find this alternative. It is precisely because we find that those way did not work that they decide to go a different way. Back in the 1980s, we've tried more extensive urbanization, but it didn't lead to nowhere. Now we are more or less consciously doing this, not just we're talking about rural rejuvenation, rural development. We're focusing on health because that's the most basic, most essential element for us. And it has something to do with both our body and our mind, and not has very little to do with profit, market, or money. So coming back to the second aspect, it is impossible to mechanically simply go back to the tradition they used to have. But as long as such civilization is not already dead, not already only part of an exhibition in a museum, as long as they continue despite all the changes they have, like the traditional Chinese script have become simplified. As long as it's still there, we still have hope.
So all of this is counted as cultural, including the mentality, including the way we interact with people. This is living culture. And just relying on the Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism is not enough. We need to, on the base of the self-cultural awareness, all the traditional civilization needs to combine with the reality. We cannot copy what is from outside, including the Marxism, because this will bring disaster. And today, it seems like all the prominent, this kind of new neoliberal economics is only of 30 years old. So the capitalism include and all the entailing ways of living and ways of production is no longer than 300 years old. How can it be the only choice? How can be there is no other alternatives? Especially in this 300 years, they bring more harm than good, including the unsustainability of economics of the environment. So this is like the Pandora's box. There is all the harm coming out of the box. So we need the confidence that we used to have in the society, in the community is gone, is lost. But this is more than that. So that's why I said that we need include the other culture, including that the other culture other than the Han culture in Chinese culture that can be reactivated, rediscovered. And thirdly, just like the Jung-Ok professor said, that we need to have this kind of integration into the community. This is a process of reconstruction of the community, including what has been forgotten, what has been neglected. We need to rediscover them. Of course, some of those alternative thinkings are in the marginalized area, including Africa, etc. So the migrate, for example, I actually I've realized, I find that all the migrant workers from the west of China, they come to east. They only find themselves in this kind of self-torture. And then in the end, they go back to the hometown in the west, where they can find all kinds of exploration and alternatives. So instead of self-destruction, or this kind of very limited experience, limited practice that is westernized or destroyed by the destroyed or replaced. This are two questions why I said the plural alternatives. Of course, if there's only one, but we can also discuss on that. But this kind of 300 years of modernity of the capitalism, we can totally just replace it with one alternative. Or this kind of, like the earlier when I talked about the Chinese way of calling this affluent families, or this kind of, or just like MOHANTY professor mentioned, of the inclusive culture. So if we want to say, put it in one word, that is the ecological civilization. When it comes to the institution, when it comes to the institution, or how can we put into reality of all of these alternatives, but at least we can explore on that aspect and try to benefit everybody. So so you cannot call it that there's no alternative, because this is a serious thinking, and we can put it into practice. And it is also necessary to keep this kind of positive thinking, this kind of optimism, because if we see everything in the dark side, then we cannot just like saying that we cannot just like what that Professor Dai has quoted, like if you just see that the world is very dark and the reality is complex, then there's no way out. No.
So thank you. While we are having Professor Huang to respond to questions, we have one question from our friend from Ecuador, Victor Hugo. So Victor, please unmute and ask your question. Victor will speak in Spanish, so please tune in to either the Chinese or the English channels for the interpretation. So Victor, please.
Buenos días y buenas noches a
Good morning, good evening to everybody, to all the participants of this important forum, especially for the topic on modernity and the challenges for civilization and society. My question is shared to the thought or the thinking of the professors. In terms of the big talent we have to preserve the community, facing the public policies of states that promote market economy and self-destruction as destructive logic that does not respect identities, whether at a national or international level, we are suffering a capitalist development, supposedly a development, because that's a capitalist description, both in Africa and South America, where nature is not respected at all. And the transnational companies and the popular resistance are repressed and they are accused of terrorism. So this huge talent of facing social media that are manipulated by very few companies and people. So facing this type of struggle that we need to carry on, which is the proposals that we could have to have a real incidence from South-South. So not to stay only on discursive proposals, but also in issues of medias and institutions participating in democratic processes that represent the communities in the state. This is my main concern. Thank you for answering. My greetings for everybody.
Thank you, Victor. Professor Huang, please.
好，我还是说中文吧。
Okay, I'm going to speak in Chinese. I think when it comes to this kind of public policies, to a large extent, it is provided by the state. In the beginning, it is about to provide for example, the enterprises to be able to benefit the enterprises, including the boss and the owner and the employers. When we're talking about earlier, I talking about the external costs and also the taxation is also regulated by the government. Thus, when we are facing the whole situation that has all this kind of mainstream institution, because sometimes the public policy is just like for decoration, or it just has to be there, and sometimes they are just like trying to repair to some very limited extent, which means we need another type of institution. Of course, when you, just like you mentioned, the community, we need to deal with this kind of relationship between the community and the individuals. But at least, for example, in the 20th century, the worst thing is what happened in the 20th century, the Soviet Union's disintegration in such a very brutal way, in such an abrupt way. That's why the Satchel mentioned that there's no alternative. But China, with the largest population in the world, at that time, there's an American intellectual. He came up with this awareness of Beijing. He said that, well, it's not of a Washington consensus. China and India, with its large population, it didn't follow the Washington consensus. It didn't follow this consensus to organize its production. That's why he came up with the Beijing consensus. So instead of IMF, instead of the Washington consensus that is reached after the meeting between the Washington and the bankers and etc. So these two big countries in Asia, India and China, didn't follow the Washington consensus to organize its society and production. So on this sense, your question, although well, I would like to say that with or without China, the society is different. The world is different. Although there are so many questions facing in China, he has a large population. It is a developing country. It doesn't follow the same logic of the economics of the capitalism. And this recently we saw so many this kind of bribery and all the problems in the politics, but they never dare to do it in public way. So this is the difference, because this kind of when you talk about the public policy, it can also take an approach that is non-capitalist. And this is what I would like to comment first. But when it comes to like the praxis, of course, it needs to implement it and adjust it. Well, there are lots to do. That's why in the state-owned enterprises or in China's manufacturing industry, or how can we try to reactivate the fine tradition of the Chinese civilization? All the efforts on these aspects also need to be improved on the aspect of the public policy, instead of just following the capital logic, the logic of capital.
Thank you, Professor Huang. So now I would like to invite Professor Lee to respond to the question. And then there, in the chat room, there's also a question addressed to Professor Lee by Jing Sui that says, "Thank you for your amazing presentation. I'm very interested in and inspired by the concept of locality. I have two questions. Does the inclusiveness that locality requires imply a cosmopolitan stance? Could you please illustrate further on its application? For example, does diaspora community a form of locality?" So Professor Lee, please.
Okay, I will answer very briefly about the first question about the Korean agricultural experience, which is relatively successful. First, we because we are very state-sponsored modernization country, so the rate of urbanization is very rapid and drastic. But formally, some kind of the former urbanization, but the ordinary people's way of life and thinking, they carried their rural life. So we build that there are many sociological research there within Seoul. There are many communities were there. So they live in their old way. So some kind of mutual help and some kind of a communal support system were there. But it was the first generation. The memories and their lifestyles have been kept even after urbanization. But second and the third generation, because of different socialization process, they were detached, like Professor Dai already commented. So that was the before it is too late, we should do something. So, and the second, our generation, retired baby boomers now who have a vivid memory of their rural life, they started return migration, very voluntary return migration. They carried all the resources they have achieved during their lifetime. So they built a new community. So after their some return migration, we call it return. And the third movement is that the young generation who couldn't get the job and any of opportunity, and they faced a certain unsustainability within the urban life because the housing prices and everything is just so high. So they decided to go to rural, build their own rural life in a very creative way. So the government partially supported that young people who decided to begin their rural startup and the new rural life. So we will see the new mapping and the changes which were built by those newcomers. So we want to reach the more general. Lastly is a very strong farmers movement. In Korea, we have a voluntary cultural revolution. So most of the students during the colonial times, they spent at least 1 month and several weeks in the rural community. they do farming. So I did it for 10 days during my university days also. So it is a long tradition of student movement to do something for rural community building, and some kind of, it composed of a strong farmers movement to coping against those kind of the government decision-making process against the neoliberal agricultural product import. So those kind of four streams is composed of a new landscape for our after urbanization. And for the locality, it is still very vague concept, but I became more clear after presentation of Professor Wang Ping, because we should create our own universal value other than the modernity or designated universal value. So we need some kind of common sense, but based on long tradition, which were very respect their own eco life also. So new civilization. So each community has their own common sense in certain way. So even though they cannot communicate each other, so they found a very similarity of their way of life. So I think those kind of findings and encountering added locality. So some kind of increase more commonality among themselves. So something which is more valuable can be increased. It is the process of construction of locality. So sometimes we are trying to more open to other diaspora, other foreign immigrants to share their own wisdom, their own wisdom based on ancient wisdom or their old civilization. So that can make good resources to reconstruct locally. That is until now my big conceptualization based on the working with the multicultural family. So we have supported the program for multicultural family, and then the many Korean old farmers visited their house, and they share certain wisdom, and they share and so respect the differences and find the commonalities. So I thought it is a kind of locality, building of locality. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lee. So Professor Mohanty, please.
Thank you. There are many resources in every tradition to fight against colonialism and colonial modernity, colonial development pattern, and colonial cosmology or worldview. But it's very important to be clear about the methodology of studying traditions. The methodology has to be dialectical. And so you have to see what practices have evolved positively, what knowledge systems have evolved negatively, because we are all, using parameters of today, what we see, what are the positive values for freedom, for communities' common welfare, and so on. So with that in mind, when you look at tradition, I think the indigenous peoples of India, we call them Adivasis, have great traditions of rebelling against colonialism and also asserting their practices, production practices, health practices, understanding of nature. During COVID-19, so many of their traditional practices became very relevant and discussed. Same way, there are many reports from Africa also about the same kind of experience, and also from Latin America. So I'll give you two examples generally how tradition has to be seen both positively and negatively. For example, in India, the caste tradition is very negative, Brahminic tradition. But the struggle against Brahminism is equally powerful. And that struggle continues even today through various ways. Those who know the Indian social scene, they know this. Similarly, patriarchy. In most traditional societies like China, India, patriarchy has been very strong part of tradition. But also there have been female goddesses, female elements of challenging male gods, and so many things. In India, the Lakshmi story is well known as a challenge to caste system perpetuated by Jagannath, and so on. Therefore, traditional resources have to be used, but with critical understanding. Finally, when we look for alternatives, and I was very excited by the presentations the other day by the global tapestry of alternatives, and we are all part of that. Friends, of course, the dominant elite would like us to assimilate into that dominant pattern. We reject that. So we critique. So that is critical literature of the dominant. Then we come up with alternatives. Another world is possible. So we come up with alternatives. But please remember, alternative is always in reference to the dominant and not emerging independently from people's traditions, people's struggles, people's problems. That is why I'm part of a group, a trend of thought, which talks about creative possibilities. We have actually a society in India called Creative Theory Association. So assimilation, critique, alternative, then creative possibilities. I think all of you, today's presentations, present and many, Victor the other day and today also, hinted at that. I mean, despite repression, we are all presenting creative possibilities, not just alternative. It's more than alternative. We are finding new energies, new resources, which were suppressed and ignored by colonialism and our dominant elites. So we are a community. South Forum, I consider, is a community of creative seekers of possibilities. Thank you.
Thank you. We also have one question for Professor Dai. So, Jadi, please.
There's a question for Professor Dai. No matter how pessimistic we are about the present and the future, no matter whether we have a choice or not, we still have to live and keep on facing this world that is getting worse and worse. You also said that there is only one Earth. For young people, besides being pessimistic and lying flat, what else can we do? And how can we explore the future path? Thank you for this question. It seems like this is a very concrete question that what we can do. Actually, this is a big question because all the question is included in this question. To be frank, sometimes I am happy that I'm already at this age that I can die without regret. If tomorrow I will pass away, believe me, I have no regrets of all my life. But it's not that I have nothing to miss from this world. How can we answer this question? What can we do? Well, first, I believe that we have to see how serious the problem is, how serious the crisis is. From the topic, from the theme of this 9th South-South Forum, we can already envisage that we already see that the 5 years of capitalism, 500 years of the modern civilization is already disintegrating, and the problems are not occurring only in the third world countries, but also in the whole wide world, including the developed countries. And there is also never seen this kind of imminent war is already closing in. And that's why I believe, I think that to such a future that is not that bright, we have to prepare for it. That is the first thing we can do. I would like to repeat one more time that about crisis, about the efforts of surviving. Are we prepared for that? And how are we going to face this, not only by ourselves, but also holding hands of the people that is next to us, so that we can save ourselves through this mutual saving, through this collective saving. And this is like the base, I think is the bottom line. And to create is also necessary, is indispensable. These few years, I keep realizing how ignorant I am, because to such a state of an imminent crisis, I don't have knowledge, I don't have language or a ready-made plan, or I think I realized how poor is my imagination. But from that perspective, I believe this is a good start to accept your ignorance, so that you can start to learn, you can start to acquire knowledge. And such a process is also a process of creation. I believe in today's China, once we start to have this kind of cultural awareness and such to build our cultural confidence, it could be expressed as what the question is. As the question says, that we have this kind of misunderstanding that that earlier question about that our Chinese civilization with the Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism, that can we just use those to face this kind of crisis of the capitalism? Well, the answer is no, because the capitalism's victory in China is the process of the defeat of our traditional civilization, and we cannot just forget about it. And also, the traditional civilization is far from the reality, far from the crisis that we are facing. It's different types of knowledge. The traditional civilization needs a huge process of reinterpretation, and the traditional Chinese civilization is also not limited to the Confucianism or Taoism. Its richness, its complexity is what it is valuable. And also, China's problem is also not just limited to China. It cannot be solved just within Chinese culture or Chinese civilization. So to accept that we are ignorant, to accept that we need to learn and we don't have a ready-made resources for us to pass through, to face the problem. From here, from this starting point, we will live. And we will, in the fight for surviving, we will imagine. I think this is necessary. And for every concrete individual, I think earlier in South Africa, I've already mentioned earlier, my friend, an American scholar, he said, can we just reduce one shower of every day? Can we just reduce 5 minutes of every shower? And in this way, in this such a simple way, we can reduce the waste of the water resources. And that's how we can try to change this definition of comfortable life that the Western civilization put onto us. And how can we start to spend more time to work with other people, to pass some time with others and to share? Because this means to get out of your comfort zone, to accept this all kinds of hardships or this kind of discomfort, to be with others. And then we can extend the intimacy with the others, to rebuild the relationships so that we can start to build the organicity of the society and try to meet the others. From such a simple steps, we can try to face the word that was all the populism and neo-fascism, also to face the future that might caused by this scarcity or the hardships, and to face this kind of politics of hatred, because we need to create love, to give love. So that's why I say tomorrow, if I leave this world, I will live without regret, because I have loved, because I have tried to make this net of love with all my heart. So that's why we have to keep on looking, we have to keep on exploring the alternatives to capitalism, and everybody can start from their own daily life, start from their own life. I believe there are lots that we can do. To be concrete, that if, for example, how can we try to deal with all the face masks that we are throwing away every day? Have we realized that they are killing all the maritime animals, and also they are piling up in all of those insoluble rubbish? How can we, while trying to preserve our own life, to preserve the lives of the others, of the other living beings?
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Dai, and thanks to Professor Mohanty and Professor Lee for your very illuminating thoughts. So I would like to give the last words to Professor Huang Ping.
I don't have much to offer since everyone have given a very good comments. I'll add a little bit on top of what Professor Dai said. As we all say, all the opportunities are left for those who are prepared. It is the same for both the individual and the society. For the third world, we've experienced the 3 centuries of difficulties and pain. We've also had hope and achievements. But if capitalist modernity is at least dominant for the time being, and then to a great extent, the real light of victory or light of hope, in the words of Lenin, is that it's the time when the system cannot continue. But that time, when that capitalist system can no longer continue, if we are not prepared for that moment, it may lead to another type of chaos, like the big setback as described by Karl Marx. There will be unimaginable wars or disasters. But what if we are prepared, whether on the front of theory or practice? Even that seemingly strong neoliberalism and that 300 years of capitalism, it may collapse one day. And facing that, we need to have the third world, the South Forum. Without this, it will be very different when they collapse. If there had not been such forces such as the third world, the South Forum, which are attempting to construct a socialism with the support of the good tradition, which are worthy of being picked up. But what if we are not consciously and doing this every day, practicing this every day? If we have a systemic thing from the practice, from theory to practice. So with this, if there is this capitalist crisis that we cannot overcome, it will be an opportunity for all alternatives. So as for the individual period, or for the different locations and spaces we are in, the different societies we are in, we will have an opportunity to connect the dots and form a system which bring about the alternative that we want to see. Thank you.
Thank you.